bleeding out from a stab wound in a saloon alley. A cowboy carried her to his cabin and gave her a sunrise. The knife was still in my hand when I found her. Not the blade, I'd dropped that someplace back in the dark, back where the night had gone sideways on me. I mean the handle of my own folding knife, which I'd been meaning to oil since October and never did, the hinge stiff now against my thumb as I crouched down in the alley mud behind the drover's rest and held it open for the light it gave me. What little there was, a sliver of lamplight bleeding off the saloon's back window, enough to see what I almost stepped on. She was on her side. Her dress, it was green once, or had been, was dark and wet along her ribs. The smell reached me a half-second after the sight of it. Iron. Warm and too close. I said her name before I knew it. Cora. She'd worked the drover's rest for 3 years. I came through maybe every 6 weeks with a trailing herd or a supply run, or no reason at all when I was honest with myself, just the habit of the road pulling me back through Harlan Flats. I'd drunk enough at that bar to know the shape of her in the lamplight without staring. I'd never once said her name to her face. And here it was, out of my mouth in an alley at 2 in the morning, and her eyes came open at the sound of it. She looked at me the way a person looks when they're deciding whether dying is better than trusting someone they don't know well enough. I said, I'm going to pick you up. Tell me if the blade's still in. She said it wasn't. Her voice was thin. Already working too hard. I got one hand under her knees and one behind her shoulders, and I stood. She weighed less than I expected and more than I wanted, that specific weight a hurt person carries, the weight of everything gone wrong condensed into one bad moment. Her head came against my collar. I could feel her try to hold herself rigid so as not to burden me further, and I said, quietly, don't do that. Let go. She let go. I walked the length of the alley without a plan and came out the far end onto the freight road and kept walking. My horse, a grulla named Soot who had no patience for ceremony, stood at the rail outside the livery 2 blocks down. I'd been heading there before I'd heard the sound in the alley, that particular sound a body makes against a wall. Not a fall, not a fight, something quieter and more final, and had turned back without thinking. There was no doctor in Harlan Flats. The nearest one, a man named Prewitt, was 11 miles north, and Prewitt drank. My cabin was 4 miles west on the edge of the Arroyo Seco grazing land. A small place. No one had told me to be proud of it, and I wasn't particularly, but it was solid and dry, and I had what a man needed to close a wound if he'd done it before, which I had, twice on myself, and once on Soot after a wire crossing gone wrong. I got her up onto Soot in front of me with her weight leaned back against my chest, and I kept one arm around her the whole way, the other hand on the reins, and I tried to keep him to a walk because every trot made her breath catch in a way I didn't want to hear again. She was conscious the whole ride. That surprised me. She asked me once in a voice that worked harder than it should have had to where we were going. My place, I said. She didn't answer. I couldn't tell if that was trust or just the resignation of someone who didn't have options. I told myself it didn't matter which one. I was going to bring her in and close that wound and keep her warm, and after that she could despise me if she wanted. The cabin was dark when we arrived. I got the lamp lit before I got her down, so she'd have something to come into. I settled her on the bunk, mine, the only one, and got a look at the wound in real light for the first time. It was bad, not unsurvivable, but close enough to unsurvivable that I didn't say anything for a moment. Just gathered what I had. A needle I kept in a tin with a card of black thread. A bottle of rye I'd been saving for nothing in particular. 2 clean cloths, clean being a relative word for a man alone, but they'd been washed within the month, and that was something. A piece of harness leather for her to bite down on if she needed it. She looked at the leather and then looked at me and said, I've had worse. I said, you sure about that? A long pause, then no. We didn't talk much while I worked. She made sounds I pretended not to hear, and I made them back to her in a low way, not words, just the thing you do when you want a person to know they're not alone in it. At some point she took hold of my wrist, not asking me to stop, just anchoring herself, and I let her hold on. Her grip was strong, stronger than I'd thought she had left in her. When it was done, I sat on the floor with my back against the bunk because there was nowhere else to sit, my legs straight out in front of me, and I listened to her breathe, and every breath was an argument against the worst outcome, and I found I cared about that argument more than I'd cared about anything in some time. She said, after a while, you live here alone. 1.5 years now, I said. You always this quiet? I thought about it. Yes, I said. She made a sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh before she thought better of it. I got up around first light to put the stove going. She was asleep when I checked, and I stood a moment in the door between the main room and the bunk room. It wasn't much of a dividing wall, more of a suggestion of one, and watched her chest rise and fall, that deliberate rise and fall that says the body has decided to continue, and I thought about the last year and a half. How it had accumulated into a particular kind of silence, not the peaceful kind, the kind that follows a decision made badly. My wife had gone 4 years before. I don't mean died, I mean gone. Taken herself and the small girl and gone back to Missouri to her mother's house. And her last letter had said things that were accurate enough that I'd kept it and not answered. And then I'd come out here to a piece of land nobody else wanted and built a place and worked it and tried to make something out of the particular shape that was left of me. I wasn't bitter about it. That's the thing people would expect me to say I was, but I wasn't. I understood it. You can understand a thing and still have it hollow you out. She was awake when I brought the coffee. She sat up carefully, one hand pressed flat below her ribs, testing what movement cost. I handed her the cup, and she wrapped both hands around it and looked out through the single window beside the bunk, which was just beginning to show the particular gray that comes before the color. She said, "I don't even know your name." "Harlan," I said, then before she could ask, "Yes, the same as the town. My family settled it, sold out years back, I just kept the name." She looked at me over the cup. She said, "They stabbed me and left me, in case you wanted to know." I said I'd wondered. "A man I'd told no," she said. "Not a customer. A man who worked there." She said it flatly, the way you say a thing when you've already decided you won't cry about it again. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything useful to say. I refilled her cup when she finished, and I stood at the window, and we watched the gray begin to pink over the ridge to the east, which was something I'd gotten in the habit of watching alone. Those few minutes of color before the day got hard again. It was pink and then a thin line of orange and then gold breaking across the rock face of the ridge and the shadow of the cabin stretching long out behind us. And she said, "Lo, I didn't think I was going to see this again." I said, "It happens most mornings." She said, "I know, it's different when you thought you wouldn't." I turned and looked at her because I knew what she meant. I knew it from a night in the winter before last when I'd lain in that bunk and looked at the ceiling for a long time and decided, slowly and deliberately, that getting up was still worth the trouble. Some mornings since then I'd watched the ridge specifically because of that night, because the color coming up reminded me what I'd decided. I didn't tell her that, but I think something in the way I looked at her told her something, because she held my eyes for a moment and then she said, "Sit down, Harlan." I pulled the chair over and sat. She said, "Why did you come into that alley?" I said I'd heard something. She said, "People don't come into dark alleys in this town because they heard something." I turned the coffee cup in my hands. The handle was chipped on one side, had been since I'd bought it from a man's estate sale in Magdalena. I said, "I've been coming through Harlan Flats for 3 years, give or take, and I don't know that I ever did anything useful there that I could point to. I drank a lot of somebody else's whiskey, and I rode through, and I went home." I said, "I think maybe I went into the alley because I was running low on chances to do something that counted." She was quiet a moment, then she said it counted. She said it the way a person says a thing they mean all the way down. I didn't answer. The ridge had gone from gold to the flat bright of early morning, the shadows pulling back toward the rocks, the land opening up the way it does when the light hits it right, and you remember it's bigger than whatever trouble you're carrying. She asked if she could stay until she could ride. I said the bunk was hers, and the stove was going, and there wasn't anything pressing that required her to be anywhere else on my account. She looked at the window again. She said, "You know what I keep thinking." I said I didn't. She said, "I keep thinking I would have died there and nobody would have wondered where I went for 2-3 days, maybe more." She said it without bitterness, with a kind of factual tiredness. She said that's the part that's worse almost. Not the knife, just that. I said I understood that part. She looked at me and I looked at her, and she said, "Yes, I think you do." I went out and did the morning, fed the 2 horses, checked the water barrel, split enough wood to last through the cold night that was coming. The kind of work I'd learned to do without thinking, one thing and then the next, which was the only way I knew how to keep the days from collapsing on themselves. Soot stood at the fence and watched me with his typical skepticism, and I told him he could keep his opinions to himself. She slept most of that day. I cooked what I had: dried beans and salt pork, nothing to brag about, and left a bowl by the bunk for when she woke. She ate it without complaint, which told me something about the life she'd led. On the second morning, she came out of the bunk room on her own and sat at the table while I made the coffee. She moved carefully, one hand still hovering near her side, but she moved. She asked if there was anything she could do to help, and I said she could sit still and not tear open what I'd closed, and she said that sounded like an instruction she could follow. She was different at the table than she was in the drover's rest. Not softer exactly, more like the part of her that had to perform for people all day wasn't running anymore, and what was underneath was just a woman, tired and sharp-eyed in particular. She had opinions about things, about the land, about the weather coming in off the southwest, about a horse she'd owned once in Kansas. She talked like someone who'd been keeping her own counsel for a long time and had things banked up. I found myself saying more than I usually said. On the third day, she asked about my wife. I don't know how she knew there'd been one. Maybe she didn't exactly and was just asking a question about the absence of things. There were 2 hooks by the door, but only 1 hat, 1 set of spurs. She had eyes that caught what was missing as much as what was there. I told her what I told you, the plain version. She listened without offering me absolution, which I respected. She just let it be what it was. She said, "And you've been out here since?" "Year and a half," I said. She said, "Building something." "Trying to," I said. I turned my coffee cup in my hands. I said, "Mostly just surviving it, honestly. Trying to decide if it's worth the trouble of building." She looked at me for a moment. She said, "It's worth it." I said, "You're saying that because I sewed you up." She said, "I'm saying it because I've known men who were worth it and men who weren't, and I know the difference." She looked out the window at the ridge, which was going pink again with the early light, and she said, "You went into a dark alley for someone you didn't know. You carried her 4 miles. You sat on the floor all night to listen to her breathe." She turned back to me. She said, "That's worth it." My hands were still on the cup. I held on to it a moment longer than I needed to. She said, "Harlan." I looked at her. She said, "I'd like to stay here a while, if that suits you." Outside, soot was at the fence. The ridge was going from pink to orange. The morning was doing what mornings do when you give them the chance, which is open up into something you didn't expect. I said, "It suits me." She nodded once. She turned back to the window. We sat there while the light came up, her with both hands around her cup, me with mine, and the color moved across the rock face the way it had every morning since I'd been out here watching it. And it was the same, and it wasn't the same, and I didn't try to name the difference. I just let it sit there between us like the thing it was. At some point, she reached across the table and set her hand over mine, not asking anything, not making a declaration. Just the warm, flat weight of her hand on mine, the way you touch something to tell it you know it's there. I didn't move. I let the morning keep going. The ridge finished going gold. The shadows pulled back from the yard. The land stretched out past the fence as far as I could see, rough and dry and wide and mine. And for the first time in a year and a half, I felt the full weight of the word mine, not as the weight of debt and labor, but as the weight of something that mattered enough to keep. I turned my hand over and held hers. That was the morning. The rest of it I've carried a different way than everything before. Not like something I'm managing, not like a thing I'm surviving the length of, but like something I'm in the middle of still, with the color still coming up off that ridge and her hand still in mine at the table while the coffee goes cold, and neither of us is particularly inclined to hurry.